University, and I want to thank you all for your attendance this evening. To begin with, I'd like to acknowledge our panelists. Jim Hoagland, who's a Rock Hill native and Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and also an honorary degree recipient from Winthrop University in 1995, and Mary Cutis, a columnist with the Roll Call and an award-winning journalist as well. You'll hear from both of them shortly, and we're very pleased to have both of them here to share their experiences and insight with all of us. For the Winthrop campus, tonight's discussion is the concluding event of the News Literacy and the Future of Journalism series. We have spent the last two semesters exploring how changes in the nation and the world may alter how we create and consume news. We look both at the past and the future with discussion on everything from political cartoons to nonprofit journalism. The mission was clear: give the audience the tools they need to be critical consumers of the news and demystify the relationship between the media, the government, and our citizens. We're pleased to announce that this series has been really a success for us. According to survey data compiled from audiences during the series, nearly 90% of those responding said that they intend to use more critical thinking in their assessment of the media, and 94% said they have a better understanding of the impact of journalism on democracy. Those are great successes for all of us. Winthrop wishes to thank our collaborators and sponsors, including SC Humanities, the Mellon Foundation, Pulitzer Prize, the SC Press Association, North Carolina Humanities Council, the Museum, and the John C. West Forum on Politics and Policy. I'd also like to thank the Winthrop Departments of Mass Communication and Political Science, who are key organizers of these events. Many thanks to everybody who made this series possible, and to our students and members of the community and experts who contributed to all of these discussions. I'm now going to turn it over to Randy Akers, Executive Director of SC Humanities. So thank you.
Thank you, President Mahoney, and good evening, everyone. I'm Randy Akers, Executive Director of South Carolina Humanities. The humanities are how we understand ourselves, our world, and how we communicate that understanding to others. South Carolina Humanities promotes, funds, counsels, and coordinates all manner of thoughtful discussion and some thought-provoking endeavors as well. Exhibits, documentaries, discussion forums, research, planning, workshops, dramatizations, lectures, all formats that pertain to the humanities. We're proud to have collaborated with Winthrop University and the South Carolina Press Association to plan and present this important series, News Literacy and the Future of Journalism, which began last September. This is the 10th of the 11-part series, which concludes Saturday at the South Carolina Press Association meeting in Columbia. We extend special appreciation to Sherry Paul Watkins and the staff of the North Carolina Humanities Council, our sister agency, whose support made this evening's event possible. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to publicly thank Winthrop University for allowing us to use their facilities during this past academic year, and for the hard work and dedication of the faculty and staff who have been part of this amazing programming. Now a few words from Sherry Paula.
Good evening, everyone. I am Sherry Paula Watkins. I'm Executive Director of the North Carolina Humanities Council. As a statewide nonprofit and affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Council serves all North Carolinians, and our headquarters are based in Charlotte. We also serve as the North Carolina Center for the Book, through which we operate a number of different literary opportunities. Very honored to be here tonight, both as a sponsor here and as a sister state council. South Carolina is also my home state, and Randy Akers was my boss for 12 years. I have a very deep love for South Carolina. Still have a home in Hartsville, South Carolina. And I was just there this past weekend. Throughout the years, I've had many positions in South Carolina communities. My most rewarding was the one as director of the South Carolina Book Festival and assistant director of the South Carolina Humanities, and working with Randy. There are 56 state humanities councils and territories across the country. We like to call ourselves the Power of 56 that organize ourselves and bring you programs like this. with a community of volunteers and those who have a passion to really make them happen in your community, just like this one tonight. Caitlin Patton Stanley is here as our staff, and she's been running these series in North Carolina for us. Again, it's about an opportunity to come together as a community and to celebrate what we can do. This program is a national grant initiative through State Council's Democracy of the Informed Citizen, administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils, and provided by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, awarded to the State Councils $1.7 million to bring you these types of initiatives. And I hope you'll enjoy your time tonight. And with my pleasure, I would like to introduce Dr. Jennifer Disney. She is professor and chair of the Department of Political Science and director of the Women's and Gender Studies program at Winthrop University. Dr. Disney.
Good evening. It is an honor for me to be here with you all this evening as a moderator for tonight's event, Speaking Truth to Power, a conversation between Jim Hoagland and Mary C. Cutis. Before I introduce them to you, I want to tell you a little bit about our series, and a lot of this you have heard from our opening speakers. As you've heard, this is number 10 of 11 events that will conclude next weekend in Columbia. We've been thrilled to have a great turnout and to have the fabulous sponsors that we have had. Here are some of our sponsors. We could not do it without you. And what we're really trying to do is have a conversation about democracy and the informed citizen. This has been a national effort to really help us think about how do we make these connections between the public's knowledge and appreciation for really thinking about what does it take to have a democracy? What does it take to engage in the kinds of conversations that we are lucky to have because we have award-winning journalists like the two that are sitting here with us this evening? And how can we make sure that we are an informed citizenry that can, in fact, speak truth to power and help hold our elected officials accountable? This is the conversation we're going to have this evening. We want to let you all know that your feedback is really important to continue to get the national grants to be able to do this kind of programming. So I've got this QR code up here now. Sometime before the evening is over, I'm going to ask you all to please complete the 1-minute survey. We'll come back to this at the end, but it's really important for us to be able to continue this kind of programming to get your feedback. In addition, we've passed out index cards and pencils to all of you, all of the members of our audience. We want to collect throughout the evening so that we can answer your questions during our Q&A period. So as you're listening to our conversation, please write down any questions that come to mind, and Professors Moyan and Reel will be picking these up later throughout the program. And now, without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. Rock Hill native Jim Hoagland is a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who began his career as a reporter with the Rock Hill Evening Herald in 1958. It's my understanding his mentor is here with us this evening as well. So let's give him a round of applause. Thank you for being here. Hoagland went on to serve for 4 decades as an associate editor, senior foreign correspondent, and columnist for the Washington Post, becoming a contributing editor to the Post in January 2010. Born right here in Rock Hill, South Carolina, Hoagland is a graduate of the University of South Carolina. He attended postgraduate programs at both the University of Aix-en-Provence in France and Columbia University in New York. Writing for the Washington Post, he won the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting in 1971 for his coverage of the struggle against apartheid in the Republic of South Africa. He also received the Overseas Press Club Award for International Reporting in 1977. Again for the Post, Hoagland won the Pulitzer Prize for Commentary in 1991 for his columns on events leading up to the Gulf War and on the political turmoil within the Soviet Union. In 2002, the editors of 7 leading European newspapers headed a jury that awarded Hoagland their Chernobyl Europa Prize. Additionally, he is the author of South Africa, Civilizations in Conflict, published in 1972. Hoagland is an Annenberg Distinguished Visiting Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and is also known for receiving the Legion of Honor, France's equivalent to the British knighthood, for his lifelong efforts to better Franco-American relations. Please join me in welcoming Jim Hoagland. Mary C. Cutis, a columnist at Roll Call, is an award-winning journalist and educator. She has contributed to NBC, NPR, The Washington Post She the People blog, The Root, Women's Media Center, MSNBC, ESPN, and WCCB TV in Charlotte. Cutis has worked at the New York Times, the Charlotte Observer, the Baltimore Sun, the Arizona Daily, and the Associated Press, and was national correspondent for AOL's Politics Daily, covering the 2008, 2012, and 2016 presidential election campaigns, and events such as the first National Tea Party Conference in Nashville. Cutis is a senior facilitator with the Op-Ed Project at Yale University, Cornell University, and the Ford Foundation, and at the Aspen New Voices Fellowship in Johannesburg, South Africa. A 2006 Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, Cutis was also chosen for the Keplinger Program in Public Affairs, journalism's first social media fellowship at Ohio State in 2011. Cutis was selected to be included in the History Makers, promoting events and organizations important to the African American community and to American society, archived in the Library of Congress. She has received numerous awards, including 6 Clarion Awards from the Association for Women in Communications, 3 first-place awards from the National Association of Black Journalists, and the Thomas Wolfe Award for reporting on Confederate heritage groups. Cutis has also contributed to several books, including an essay in Love Her Not, The Hillary Paradox. She serves on the Advisory Council of Women and Girls Research Alliance at UNC Charlotte, and is a former Journalism and Women's Symposium board member. Her coverage specialty is the intersection of politics, culture, and race. Please join me in welcoming Mary C. Cutis. Thank you both for being here with us this evening. And again, I'm going to ask our audience, don't forget to give us your assessment on the value of the evening's conversation. So I'm going to start you guys off with a question for either of you. Do journalists and members of the news media have a responsibility to hold local, national, and international elected officials, business leaders, and other political and economic power holders accountable? And if so, why and how?
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. The short answer is yes, we do. But it is complicated, of course, particularly when you consider, and I've known you've done some programs on it, business models that have weakened the staffing and financing of in-depth news coverage, particularly in local news organizations. But we've seen how investigative and watchdog journalism is not only essential, but it's also really in demand and popular with readers. A few examples that I can really think of that are really close in hand, right up the road in the 9th District in the U.S. House District in North Carolina, which is, of course, the longest undecided midterm race that also happens to be my district. It was local reporters, particularly local TV reporters, who had been investigating some voting irregularities in the absentee balloting in Bladen and Robeson counties, and they actually went and they knocked on doors and did some good shoe leather reporting. And that actually had an effect on democracy because a new election was eventually called, but they really did the interviewing and the reporting that came to be. This morning I was watching NBC, and they had Al Roker actually in the Arctic investigating climate change and actually talking to folks in the communities whose livelihoods have been affected by climate change and whose very cities are often falling off into the water. So I think we can see in many cases that it is really essential that we do hold not only politicians, but policymakers and businesses accountable. We've seen lately with Boeing being in the news how holding businesses accountable can be a matter of life and death. But I also think we have to hold ourselves accountable as journalists. There can be flaws in our reporting, places where it's not complete. Some of it, I think, is because we don't have enough diversity in how we cover it, in the decision makers and policy makers and newspapers themselves. So we should also be careful of that and hold ourselves accountable, because that's the only way the public will actually have trust in us, particularly if we get these effects of calling fake news. An example of that might be, I grew up in West Baltimore, and when you are in a community that you see covered by the press, media you're a part of, but you start to see the holes in it. And when the situation a few years happened with Freddie Gray dying in police custody, you saw many journalists parachute into that particular neighborhood as though it were, I would say, not even a foreign country, but an alien land. And they really basically took some shots of a burning CVS and thought that was the story. And some of the local papers, the Sun had been covering some of these issues, which talked a lot about the disappearance of manufacturing in the area. So you had high unemployment, mistrust among police and communities they covered, dealing sometimes because of corruption and other issues. And also they didn't stay and follow the community that came and cleaned up, or the community center library across the street from the CVS, which stayed open the whole time. And welcome families, and it happened to be the place where actually I got my library card when I was 3 years old. And so when that happens, you see that how we can do better if we want to earn the trust of the people and of the community. So I think we have a large responsibility, and it's a big job, but I think it is so important to democracy that we really need to be careful about doing it, and to be diligent about doing our job.
I certainly agree with Mary's answer, and would just add that we, as journalists, have a really huge responsibility to this country. Freedom of the press is mentioned in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. Just imagine that at the time when the Founding Fathers were trying to create a new form of government, a new set of traditions, a new set of ideals for the rest of the world, they chose to mention that freedom of the press and freedom of speech were very important responsibilities for our democracy, very important foundation stones of our democracy. So any journalist who ever doubted that they have a responsibility to this country and to our democratic system, all they have to do is to go back and look at the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. I'd also like to take this opportunity just to welcome you all here and to thank you for coming out and doing your part in learning and in expressing yourselves. A particular word of welcome for my friend and first boss, Marshall Doswell, who was the editor at the Washington Post. It's actually due to Marshall in so many ways that we're all here tonight, because years ago Marshall said to me, "Jim, if I'm ever to come across town just to hear you talk, it'll be the 2nd of April when it snows." And that's Marshall's wisdom. And today, that snowfall today was just incredible, because it reminded me that it snowed on January 22nd, 1940. That happened to have been the day that I was born, on a farm 7 miles outside of Rock Hill. And my father, who had probably had more to drink than he should have, that day wanted to name me Snowbird. And my mother, who was a much more sensible human being, refused and named me Jim. And you can imagine how much truth to power I would have been telling under the byline of Snowbird Hoagland.
That would have been a heck of a byline.
Okay, so we all agree that journalists and members of the news media do have a responsibility to hold local, national, international elected officials, business, political leaders, economic elites, power holders accountable. But what are the costs and the benefits of imposing such accountability? Could each of you give us an example of a time when you held someone powerful accountable, and perhaps it had consequences for you, personally or professionally?
Why don't you take this one?
Well, yes. I mean, the cost to journalists who work in totalitarian systems is particularly high, of course, to those who try to hold people like Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi or Mr. Maduro, for example. Try to hold them accountable. There was an incredible number of journalists who were killed last year in the line of duty while they were actually working. 94 journalists were killed in 2018 in work-related incidents, according to the International Federation of Journalists. One of them, of course, was Jamal Khashoggi, killed in Turkey, we believe, by Saudi. I've never faced that kind of danger. I do believe that when I started writing about Saddam Hussein in Iraq in the early 1970s, I was living in Beirut. I was Middle East correspondent for the Washington Post, and I came back from a vacation to find that my apartment had been ransacked by people who, at least two persons who had broken into the apartment in Beirut and had not taken any of the jewelry or cameras or anything in the room. All they did was to take out all of the files I had on Saddam Hussein and spread them out on my desk. And I took that as a message from Saddam. Essentially, the answer to your question is that intimidation is a favorite tool of people that you have to hold accountable. That was one example that stayed with me for years. And I continued to write about Saddam, and I continued occasionally to walk out my front door and wonder if that white van that was parked there was a message from him as well.
That's an incredible experience, and I want to emphasize, as Dr. Jennings-Dizzy said in the introduction, I've worked with some thought leaders in South Africa at the Aspen New Voices Fellows, and they were from all over the globe, and they worked in a lot of different areas where it was a matter of life and death for many of them, and they were doing the work and expressing their opinions and doing reporting and other things in areas where really, they were either in hiding or under assumed names. And definitely that hasn't been, certainly what I have come across. But yes, there are costs to doing it. Sometimes you don't think about it. But, as an African-American woman who was there, and I write columns, they are reported, but their commentary, you are going to get pushback. Most of the response is basically positive from people saying, wow, that's great that you are bringing these points of view out there. But yes, you are going to get the trolling, that you've heard about. And for women, they get a certain amount of trolling that's gender-based. And some of mine is gender and racially based. You will get some lynching references. Sometimes when I'm reporting on the flag, the Confederate flag that was at the South Carolina State House, or when I was visiting Confederate heritage groups all over to report on them, that was an instance of it. So yes, you are going to be held accountable. I generally try to answer and respond to people who comment, who may disagree even angrily, but they're open to dialogue. If people are just going to name call, of course, that they're not open to that. And actually try to engage them, because oftentimes, when I work with the Op-Ed Project, we have a saying, when you say things of consequence, there may be consequences, but the alternative is to be inconsequential. And I try to live by that. But one of the instances that happened to me personally when I said something was actually something that was very close to my heart, which is my faith. I'm a practicing Catholic, and I remember doing some reporting and writing when some hierarchies of the church said that politicians who were pro-abortion rights could not receive communion or should not receive communion. And I did some reporting on that and writing on that, and I talked to some priests and others who said, if someone comes up and presents themselves to me, that's between them and God, and I'm not going to go through the aisles and ask who committed which sin. And I talked about some things, some pieces of hypocrisy in the Catholic Church itself, which, of course, now there's been much more reporting on that. And I actually heard from the diocese, and they were just curious. and I answered questions about it. And I don't know what exactly happened, but I do know my pastor came to me and wanted to assure me that he supported me as a journalist, and it was my freedom to be a journalist and report and write about any topic, and that he also welcomed me as a parishioner involved in church. And, that was quite personal, as I said, because that was a certain piece of backlash or accountability that had something to do with how I lived my life. And so that was something, that was an interesting example. And then you get the usual pushback whenever you write about anything political. There was a particular backlash from feminists, actually, when I was writing during the 2008 campaigns about some of the backlash that Michelle Obama was getting and the attacks on her femininity and other things, people calling her angry. And I said, come on, feminists, even you Hillary Clinton supporters, aren't you going to take up for her? And boy, my niece warned me, that was in the Washington Post, and she said, you don't want to look at those comments, Aunt Mary. And I said, okay, I'll just let it die down for a while. Yeah. But, another saying we have is, are you being driven by your spirit or your wound? So are you going to let any of this pushback, backlash affect going out there and trying to do the reporting and the writing that you really feel you need to do? The only thing that you just need to do is it makes you be even more scrupulous about your process, and about how you tell the story, about letting all voices be heard, and about trying to respect folks.
So I want to go back to the title for this event that we came up with together. You guys had a role in helping to shape this title. So I want to ask you, when you hear the phrase speaking truth to power, what does that mean to each of you? And what lessons have each of you learned as newspaper journalists about speaking truth to power? I mean, is it the same as holding public officials accountable? Is there something else that phrase speaks and says to you as journalists?
Well, as I said, I feel special accountability because I'm representing, in some ways, many groups that haven't held power in this country. And so I try to be sure that I make sure I tell all truths, and I do that by trying to speak to everyone. As you said, I've covered the Tea Party conventions, Confederate heritage groups. For a while there, I was like the go-to person for every conservative meeting ever. And people would wonder I was there, and some folks would say, how can you stand it? And I said, well, these are human beings, and we share a common humanity. So I really, if I want to be truthful in this search for truth that's been a part of my whole professional life, well, then I have to be open to that. But I also, sometimes people say you give voice to the voiceless, but no one's truly voiceless. It's just that sometimes we don't listen. So I try to make sure that I realize that in society there are certain groups and organizations that hold a disproportionate piece of the power, and that in order to speak that truth and to be accountable to all Americans, and as Jim said, a free press is the cornerstone of a democracy, as our founders have said, that the only way I can be successful as a journalist and just to look myself in the mirror is to make sure that I am going to all centers and not just holding the powerful accountable, but also making sure that everyone is a part of the conversation. Because, if you don't tell your story, someone else will, and they'll get it wrong. So I have to figure, whose story is not being told. If we all aren't a part of the conversation, that we'll never get to a solution of what it is to live together in this democracy.
I think that's very, very true, Mary. I would also point out that it is not simply elected representatives who hold power and who need to be told the truth. The truth is part of every human being's struggle for dignity and decency. I got a very sharp lesson in this in that very first summer that I worked at the Rock Hill Evening Herald. And Marshall, under the ownership of Talbot Patrick at the time, had written editorials that provoked the Ku Klux Klan into burning crosses on the lawns of our newspaper owner and editor. And their response, which made a tremendous and lifelong lasting impression on a young reporter, was to continue to write those editorials and to fight for civil rights in an atmosphere that was not particularly harmonious at that point. So we do have these responsibilities. We do run the cost, the risk of cost, but it is so essential to the functioning of democracy that you have to take that. As a foreign correspondent, one of the most immediate costs that is imposed on you usually is a denial of visas, which is not the greatest of all punishments that can be meted out to you. I was denied access to South Africa after I wrote my first 10-part series on apartheid. 6 years later, the South Africans decided that they would harass the editor of the Washington Post by saying that South Africa was really changing, and the editor quite sharply said back, well, you won't admit into your country the only person who could judge that. And so they gave me another visa, and I went back and wrote another 10-part series, and they declared me persona non grata once again. So you just keep at it. You keep working at it.
And I also want to say that, even though we talk about some of the things that are thrown our way, that we have really great examples to look at in journalists through history, like your editor, like others, who have done this work and suffered great consequences. I know one of my heroes is Ida B. Wells, the famous journalist, suffragist, activist, and she wrote in the late 1800s in Memphis in her paper editorials about lynchings that caused such a stir in the community. They came to burn down her presses. Thank goodness she escaped before she burned down with them, escaped to Chicago, where she continued her journalism and her activism. And folks like this, and you have many examples here in this state and in these communities who've done brave, brave work because they wanted to speak that truth, no matter what the costs were. So I always can look to those heroes and heroines to see examples, of course, of how they did their work and also of how they stood up for it. And then to say, you know what? Okay, yeah, it's worth it. Yeah.
I think it's so important that you spoke about covering the truths of all sides of the political spectrum, covering the stories of the voiceless on all sides of the political spectrum that might not always get heard, and continuing to write the stories, even if they're unpopular to the majority or a minority that's coming out and burning crosses on the lawn of your newspaper, that you continue. Those are such diverse and varied examples of what speaking truth to power means as journalists. I know there are many aspiring journalists in the audience, and so I think it was really good to get such a breadth of examples to that question. Raise your hand if you're an aspiring journalist. Let's see some of our student journalists. Don't be shy, come on. Okay, terrific.
We need more.
Make sure you meet our panelists. So now I want to ask each of you a question particularly for you. So Jim, let me start with you. For many people here today who remember the events leading up to the First and Second Gulf Wars, those were a poignant time in our lives when the lines between truth and lie began to blur in our public discourse. Talk a little bit about the extent to which that is true for the period from the 1990s to the 2000s when you were covering these stories and speaking these truths. How different was this blurring of the lines between fact and fiction then that you covered compared to eras before and since, including current times?
Before I do that, and I will get to it, I just wanted to add one more instance to underline that it's not simply political power that it's important to speak truth to, but also economic power. And perhaps we'll get a little later into the discussion about the significant changes that have occurred in the newspaper business in recent years to do with the economic model and how it affects our ability to do that. But I just wanted to tell one little story about how when I was first working at the Washington Post and working for Ben Bradley, who was a great editor and a great man, a fellow reporter and I, Lynn Downey, who became Bradley's successor actually as executive editor of the Washington Post, produced a series on Savings and Loans Association in 1967, pointing out that they were funding rackets in the ghettos in particular through their mortgage lending and their corrupt practices. And we wrote our series, it ran, and after the first installment ran, a delegation of bankers from the Savings and Loans Associations of Washington came in to see Ben Bradley and told them that they would yank $1 million in those days. $1 million was a lot of money, of advertising unless he ceased publishing them. Bradley threw them out of his office. The important thing about this story, though, is that I didn't know that for another 6 months. Ben Bradley did not tell any of his reporters that that kind of pressure was being exerted at that time. Let me go to your question about Iraq, which is a difficult subject for me and for many people, I think. I think it was a very different situation between what was happening in the build-up to the Iraq War. You mentioned both Desert Storm in 1991 and the 2003 invasion. They were also quite different because in 1991, we had no idea that Saddam Hussein was working on trying to get nuclear weapons. We discovered that he had been beginning to do that as a result of the 1991 military campaign. 2003, we probably reacted overly with perhaps too much suspicion, but it wasn't that there was such a serious effort at falsification. It was that Saddam Hussein played a terrific game. His own generals believed that he was working on nuclear weapons. We can go into discussion about the aluminum tubes that were imported, we believed at the time, for nuclear purposes, but in any event, he was breaking UN sanctions by importing those tubes, even if it was for conventional purposes. Short way of saying this perhaps is that there was reason for honest mistakes. Today, much of the lying that goes on is a deliberate attempt to shake your belief in what is true, to shake your belief in how you decide what is true. So that was clearly one piece of the Russian campaign to interfere in the elections, and it continues. I think this is a much more dangerous and much more pernicious form of lying than the mistaken beliefs and the occasional and the clear exaggerations that occurred in 2003.
I just want to remind everybody, if questions are coming to you in our conversation, please write them down, because soon Professors Moyan and Ria will be coming around. Just raise your hand if you have a follow-up question, such as to that answer. Mary, I'd like to ask you a question.
Sure.
In many ways, it seems that our society today is both more aware of and more divided around the intersectional identities of race, ethnicity, immigration status, class, gender, and sexuality, just to name a few. How is it that we have become both more inclusionary and more exclusionary as a society at the same time? Does backlash politics help us explain this phenomenon, or is there something else going on?
Well, for those who say there has not been progress, and I've heard some people say things are worse today than they've ever been, and a little bit of a check to that. I can remember in the 60s when I was a toddler and my parents came home from a church dance, and they were greeted by hysteria because one of my older siblings, I'm the youngest of five, and the the three oldest were involved in the civil rights movement, and he had been arrested at a sit-in. So we're screaming, Tony's been arrested, right? So I didn't quite understand what was going on. I was pretty excited because people were so excited about that, they didn't care that I wasn't in bed yet, right? So they got a civil rights lawyer, Juanita Jackson Mitchell at the time, who was the wife of Clarence Mitchell Jr., who was the lobbyist for the NAACP. They put the largest bail on him that I had for a civil rights worker in the state of Maryland. I think it was $5,000, which could have been $1 million, right? And my parents got the deed to their house, but they were able to get my brother out. And also, I can remember wanting to go to the amusement park that hugged the road in Baltimore County and not being able to because it was segregated. And this was in the 60s. And finally, when they integrated it, and I was about 6 or so, 4 or 5 or 6, and my father took me to the roller coaster, to the amusement park, because I'd always wanted to go. And he took me on the roller coaster 4 times in a row. And I remember people were staring at us, and I asked why, and he said, well, it's because you're so pretty, Mary. So things have changed, right? That's true. But as my son, who's an historian, reminds me all the time, things go in cycles, and issues go in cycles, and grievance goes in cycles. So now we have an abundance of news organizations, cable shows, all of these things. So that's kind of a contradiction. Why you have a paper like the Cleveland Plain Dealer who just laid off a third of its staff. So from having over 300 people, now they have 33 people working with them. So you're getting less local news in a big market like that. You have this plethora of outlets, and you can go to the one that suits your point of view, whether it's news, whether it's Alex Jones, whatever. And you can just live in that particular silo. And that we don't have that shared place we go anymore for truth. And we show that through polls that people are dividing themselves up between rural and urban, neighborhoods, schools, this great divide, even that people sometimes are picking their friendships based on political opinion, so they're not even mixing with folks who may disagree with them. And then society is changing, so that's making some people uneasy. Polls have shown that it was less economic anxiety than fear of change, fear of changing demographics and other things that made people vote in certain ways in the last election. And you have economic change, you have manufacturing versus the idea economy. Manufacturing jobs aren't going pretty much for overseas. People are losing jobs to automation. You have income inequality, a gap that's getting greater. Social mobility, which is becoming harder and harder to achieve if you're born in a certain economic class. So that's what you have now that is causing all of this strife in many ways. People think of it maybe as a zero-sum game, that what someone gets is taking away from me, and you have people who will exploit it. So that is really difficult to cover. As I said, even when you try, as I do, even when you write a column, base it in facts and reporting. People say you have the right to your opinion, but not to your own facts, which is kind of silly because in the world there's an ocean of facts. And it's just human nature to pull the one that agrees with your point of view and discard the rest. And that's what we're dealing with now. But you do see the same cycle of stories coming back and back, whether it's voting rights or all of these things. And that's what it is that makes it so difficult to cover. But I do think that it's good to have a diversity of voices among the reporters, among the decision makers, and also to make sure that we cover stories that need to be covered, because it's not just how we cover stories, but what stories are we ignoring and which ones are we covering. As someone who covers politics, you see so much of the horse race being covered of who's ahead and who has the most money. And I would hope this time around that we do try to cover the issues more carefully, because they're more important than ever. It's interesting to see a lot of the different candidates coming out with very solid plans on things from infrastructure to teacher pay. to the farming economy, but it'll be up to us as journalists to make sure that we give these stories light and show people how it's relevant to their lives, and maybe how in the turmoil they have more in common than they would think. But it is natural for sometimes in these periods of turmoil to go toward tribe. And it doesn't help when you have certain political figures, both politicians and then other folks, as you say, in business and in all sorts of areas, trying to get a personal gain by putting their fingers in and trying to exacerbate that wedge. So that is a challenge. That is a challenge. Including journalists. Yes. Yeah.
Call themselves.
Yes. Like I said, you'll have a lot of people who are throwing things out there. Just recently the stories have caught my eye about all of the theories going around about the school shootings and things like that they're crisis actors and people are making things up, and you see the families getting so affected by this, and you will see different websites of people who say they have evidence that these things didn't happen, and it makes it even more difficult to try to cut through that particular noise.
I want to give you each a chance to talk about some of the changes happening in the industry. So Jim, you mentioned earlier the economic changes. There's also the shift to the technological age of social media. There's also maybe more of a focus on media literacy. Maybe there needs to be more of a focus on media literacy. So talk a little bit about these types of changes within the industry.
They are part of a true worldwide revolution that is comparable in many ways to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, however, was stretched out over several decades, and what happened there was that the children of people who moved from the farms into the city to take advantage of the Industrial Revolution, to be part of the Industrial Revolution, the children were able to be educated to move into the Industrial Revolution, to that changed world. Today we have a revolution, a digital revolution, in information in particular, that is both ubiquitous and instantaneous. It is happening everywhere at the same time. There is not the time for good government decisions. There is not the time to educate people to live in this changed economy that we're all now part of. And I think that is particularly it is the news industry that has been so dramatically affected, as we've seen. When I got into journalism, I think one of the basic rules was that great owners make great newspapers, great editors and great owners by hiring great editors. And the newspaper, and I really like the fact that you've used lessons of the newspaper trade, calling it a trade, in describing what we're considering here. But newspapers were commercial products. You were expected to pay your own way. Your product was and your basic product in a newspaper was your reputation for being truthful and being generally fair in reporting, and at times analyzing news. We had to protect that reputation jealously by getting it right and consistently by telling our subscribers what the truth was. And this now, you've seen the upheaval that has happened in the newspaper business as the economy has changed so much and the way in which our business model has been affected. So I think we really have to look at this changed economy and the fact that newspapers have lost about half of their staffs over the last decade or so. We've got to come up with a much more reasoned and a much more coherent approach to news as a commodity, news as an essential building block of democracy, and to make some trade-offs there to match the very changed nature of our audience and of our business. Mary.
I agree with everything Jim has said, that it's really a challenge because the business has changed, but the basic values of journalism have not. The accuracy, the complexity, the importance of getting everything right. And of course that runs counter to some of the things that we have to deal with in the business as it is now, where you want to get something fast. You want to be the first out there, the importance of clicks, of branding, which are realities of the business model that we are dealing with right now. And you're also looking at shows, whether it's radio, cable TV, whatever, where you'll have fact-based journalists representing news organizations sitting next to pundits with a point of view, and there's really no division between one or the other. So it's very easy for the viewer to look at it and just put you all in the same basket of someone who's trying to push a certain frame or a point of view. And then you also have, let's face it, companies that are working as media companies like Facebook and others that don't, but they aren't. So they don't have even the regulations that media companies have. And, a lot of people get their news from that. And you could see people struggling with that. You could see Mark Zuckerberg being called on the carpet just, and this week saying, or within the last couple of weeks, we are not going to give a platform to some groups in, saying it's just First Amendment if they're fomenting, hateful rhetoric, And that's okay. And who's to judge? But this is we're really dealing with this Wild West atmosphere right now while still trying to hold our journalism values close. It's hard to do nuance. It's hard to do context in the midst of all of that. But it's really also hard to understand what is going on now without all of those things, without using history. I use history, I use humor, I use pop culture, I use anything to try to draw people in because that's a part of it, and you're judged by clicks as well. I always loved the old school, I'm a newspaper person, and I thought, okay, by the time everything changes, I'll be well retired, and then it changed so fast. It's like, well, it happened about 15 years before I was able to retire, so I'm really going to have to figure this out. And it is still a struggle as we're dealing with as journalists and as a society. And it's so many choices for the consumer, and you've got 30 seconds to get them because they have so many other choices out there.
So I have another question I'd like to ask, but I want to get a few of our audience questions in. There's a lot of depressing news right now in our country and the world. How do you stay positive? I feel like I'm a cranky cynic. Notice the time gap to answer the question, how do you stay positive?
Well, it's not that hard for me, actually, because I'm a historical optimist. I've seen change in very, very stubborn situations, including in this state, including in this town, including in South Africa, including in the Soviet Union. People will ultimately do the right thing, as Winston Churchill said about Americans, after exhausting every other possibility. But people do learn, and with enlightened leadership, they will do the right thing over the long haul. There's the wonderful phrase from Martin Luther King about the arc of justice, and that's what I believe.
It's interesting you mentioned King because, he was so prescient about so many things, and he did change history and millions of minds, although he didn't obviously live to see so much of what's going on. So a part of it is to thinking about legacy. We think that great men and women think about their legacy, but I think we all have that, right? So everything we put down, every person we interview, every story we cover, it's a part of our legacy and the legacy of the country. Sometimes, when I write something that's critical, people will say, don't you like America, or you must hate America, and I love America. As Martin Luther King also said, just go by the words. If America only lived up to the words in the founding document, then we would all be fine. The problem is, it often doesn't. And as you say, it has to be pushed and tugged and to make it happen. And sometimes, it does. And also, this sounds, one way I say positive is to look at the beauty of the world. Look at the people you love. Look at your family. Look at the beauty of nature, of art. I listen to a lot of classical music when I just can't stand the news. And no, that's true, because it puts me in a place where I can say, okay, we're a people we are capable of producing so much beauty, and then seeing beauty in other people and in the things they do. The people who, no matter how tough the news gets, they're still volunteering for Room in the Inn. They're still doing so many things. And that, when you look at human beings in that way and talk to them one-on-one, as I do often, you see those things. And so you don't get negative. But sometimes it is a struggle, because it does sometimes seem like there's a fire hose of this kind of news hitting you all the time. There's never a lack of things for me to write about, and I'll tell you that. Yeah.
Please describe your best hope for a sustainable local, regional, or state model for journalism that can replace the traditional news media, and maybe some of the dysfunction in some of the traditional news media. You guys have any ideas for that?
Well, you're just looking at sometimes some of the things that are happening now. Some nonprofits are coming up, like the Marshall Project, which deals with criminal justice issues, or ProPublica and others, and they're partnering with different other local incubators and news organizations. They're just trying to come up with creative ways to do the work that needs to be done, and those things give me hope. But also, as I see our kid and say, in Charlotte, there's more people there that used to work for the Observer than work there, and you realize that you do need people being paid and getting benefits to do that reporting. It's not just going to appear online. But I do think some of these organizations that are doing great work. One of my former colleagues at the New York Times, Susan Shira, just left the Times to take over the Marshall Project, and they're even partnering with citizen journalists as well, folks who are incarcerated and others. So I think we just have to use our imaginations to try to do the reporting that we need to do.
I think that's right. Particularly in terms of local news, which is in a real state of crisis right now. Since 2004, 1,800 city newspapers have gone out of business, which is an extraordinary thing. And I think that it's right to identify the nonprofit organizations as an ally, and to explore more working with them. We have to find ways to offer a new access to social media that emphasizes the reality. I think it's Lily Tomlin who says that reality is a collective hunch. I think there are ways to influence social media favorably, positively, to make the instruments become more consistent and more building blocks of democracy.
Do authoritarians who want to intimidate or even kill journalists need to utilize governments to do so, or can they outsource this to extraneous supporters? Could this lead to a particular type of media repression in the United States?
Well, certainly that is the case in many places now. We're just learning a lot about which different countries use cyber espionage and cyber harassment, the trolling, and there certainly wouldn't stop at using physical violence as well, and as they do, as we saw in the Khashoggi case. How you stem that, how you work more consistently to try to limit it as much as possible is one of the great challenges that we face today.
Yeah, and also because the social media it's global at this point. So you see with some of these hate crimes and other things that are going on that, say, the assassin in New Zealand was referencing, extremists in Norway, and in South Carolina, he mentioned Dylan Roof and others. So that's the one thing where you have this connection with social media, that groups with all sorts of agendas, both good and evil, can join in to have sort of this global group. And so it gives them more power. And of course, that can be turned to media as well. And so, as Jim said, we are still really seeing the effects of how all of this is being manifest. And it's interesting to see it develop and just to try to figure out ways to stay on top of it. Yes.
We're getting down to our final few questions, so I'm going to ask you, if you haven't yet, to take our online survey. We have two great countries, the U.S. and the U.K., who are floundering now. How do you see a way out for us and our ally? Any thoughts on the U.S. and the U.K. today from either of you? I was curious your thoughts, too, so I had to ask that one.
Right. Well, the UK has presented us with a master class in political incompetence. I've never seen a group of politicians make consistently the wrong decision time after time after time, as we have in the UK over the last 3 years. Calling the referendum at that particular moment was an act of total incompetence on David Cameron's part. And Theresa May has not been able to show that she knows much better than he how to put together, how essentially to reverse one of the most stupid political acts, that is Brexit, in history, in my view. So I think it's somewhat different here. I think it is not only a measure of incompetence. I don't think incompetence is the main characteristics of the political mess that we've created. I think venality, greed, and stupidity account for a lot of what we are wrestling with today in terms of our national politics.
Well, I don't know as much about the stay, may, or D-Day options in the UK, but it'll be interesting to see how this all turns out. But it's interesting to see that it shows that really we live in a global economy and a global world at this point, and one country can't have actions that don't have ripple effects. And we can see that here in our country, whether it's our actions on climate change or the Iran nuclear deal, and just, or immigration, what is allowable and how it's tied to aid and policy and so many other things. So you really just cannot be this discrete country anymore. So I think that's gone, right? As far as I cover, domestic politics, and it's been interesting to see, our founders knew all kinds of people could ascend to the presidency, but they have checks and balances, and how some of the checks and balances have kind of gone away because of people looking to have political advantage. Maybe I'll get a judge, so I won't look at this, maybe won't do oversight. And that's been a little bit surprising. Some of it will be corrected, as I do think that American people like divided government, and the midterms showed that indeed, we do have now a Democratic-controlled House, and we see some of the oversight coming back. But then you have other issues like gerrymandering to, when is democracy not democracy? We'll see what the court's going to decide as far as that's concerned. We have a lot of challenges. We will see, as I'm covering what's coming up now with the elections, what our country's going to turn to, and then how many of the norms, so many things. It's been interesting. We don't have rules, but so much we did because of the norms, because of this is how things are done. And we've seen how they can be smashed. Are they smashed for good? Will we bounce back and reinstate some of these bipartisan norms that the country's been going along or following or trying to follow? And I think that is actually still up in the air, because some of the wounds that have been opened, as I say, and the wedges that have been exacerbated, I think we're not sure how much work we'll have to do as Americans to come back to something resembling order again.
So I am going to merge my last question and the last audience question. And before I do that, I just want to let everybody know that we have a reception this evening. After this evening's event, everyone is invited to the Evans Room, the third floor of the DeGiorgio Campus Center, to meet and eat and greet our panelists. The elevator right across from the pool tables is a way to head up to the third floor to the Evans Room, so we can continue the conversation. But first, an audience member asks, what impact has the term fake news had on journalism and speaking truth to power? And I think that connects to my final question. Many people assert that it is the news media today that is keeping this country a democracy, and perhaps not just today, but throughout the history of our nation. Others assert that the news media should report the news and not try to make the news or tell us their opinions. What do you think about each of these assertions? And what do you think about the way fake news has impacted this conversation?
Oh, you're going to hand it off to me, right? Well, I really hate that term, fake news. News isn't fake, right? And you see it's being picked up by autocrats all over the world, which is interesting and fascinating. I would not have gotten into this profession, something really, when I was young growing up and didn't see, we had our papers and we got all of them, and the way my community was depicted was not my community as lived. So I guess in a sense it was incomplete news. And so that has been my goal, to try to just tell the truth and do that. I also do write commentary, but I do, as I say, make sure it's grounded in reporting and history, so that if people don't agree with me, they can at least follow and see how I got to where I got, and that it opens up a dialogue and not a monologue. I think that, as Jim started out by saying, democracy, and a free press, it goes hand in hand. And we see so many countries, when it goes into autocratic rule, the first thing they do is they shut down the newspapers and the radio stations, and journalists who still do great work in these places, their lives are in danger, and they still do it because they realize just how important it is. And I continue to believe that it is important to tell the truth as I see it, to do the reporting, to admit errors when I make them, and to continue in dialogue with the community that I'm attempting to cover, and support others who do the same, and through my work with the Op-Ed Project to make sure the best ideas, wherever they come from, get expressed, not only in journalism, but in all of these venues, on the internet, online, in TED Talks, in your PTA meetings, in your churches, everywhere. I think thought leadership from a variety of sources is journalism of a sort, and that we all have to make sure that we play our part and don't sit back and leave it up to others to tell our truths.
My short response to what Mary has just said is amen. And to also emphasize that it is one of the most important functions of the American press is to divide opinion and news. To have an opinion section that is clearly identified as such. And I used to say that I worked for the Washington Post as a correspondent and editor for 20 years, and they paid me to keep my opinion out of the newspaper. And then I became a columnist, and they paid me to put my opinion into the newspaper, but clearly labeled. And it actually took me a while to figure out what my opinions on many questions were, because I had always trained myself not to put opinion into the news columns. This fake news, I think increasingly people will come to understand, people of good faith will come to understand that that's another way of saying, I don't agree with that. That the politicians who use that phrase are simply looking for an easy way out and for people to con. So I think it's a passing phenomenon that we all need to do much more to combat.
Please join me in thanking our award-winning panelists, Jim Hoagland and Mary C. Cutis.
Tough questions.
Yeah.
You guys did wonderfully well with the tough questions. I just want to thank the team that has put this together and made this possible. President Dan Mahoney, Judy Bynum from SC Humanities, Amy, Guy, Katerina, Crystal, Nate. It's been a tremendous series. We thank you all for your support, all of our sponsors. And let's make sure you fill out our survey. And let's continue the conversation upstairs in the Evans room. Thank you all so much for being here.